morning and welcome to our third episode in a series of 11. Today we'll be taking a deep dive into the growing aspects of the New Zealand hemp industries. And on behalf of the New Zealand Hemp Industries Association Executive, I'd like to welcome you to this episode. And I'd like to also welcome our panellists today. We have James Bailey, a grower, a farmer, from Tirau, and Anna Campbell from Abacus Bio based down in Dunedin, and Andrew Ward from Asure Quality based in Palmerston North. So as per what we've done in previous episodes, we're going to start with some presentations and then go into the Q&A. So I encourage you to put in the Q&A questions that you have, and then we'll get to those in the second half of the hour. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to James Bailey to introduce himself and the interesting things that he achieved this year. I'm sure it's quite a tremendous story from James's point of view, because it's all happened quite quickly. So quite exciting stuff. Looking forward to hearing from you, James. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having us all here today. I will briefly go through our first year growing hemp here in New Zealand in Tirau in the South Waikato, and we imported a cultivar called Finola, which originated in Finland and is and we imported it from Canada through Australia to New Zealand. So I'll flick through these slides pretty quickly. It's actually meant for a longer presentation, but I'll try to get on to the ones that are most relevant. So why did we choose hemp? And it was just a diversification option for us. We could see the potential in the crop in the future, and we saw some potential benefits to rotation in our sheep and beef and dairy farming system, and for soil health. And Ella and I really enjoy hemp seed foods. Our kids are warming up to it, and we're experimenting with different ways to get them into it. But no, it's a great healthy addition to our diet. So why Finola? We were looking for something after doing a fair bit of research, a low growing cultivar for ease of harvest, something that was auto flowering or has a shorter life cycle, so it fits well into our farming system, and we can get on to the next thing in the farming cycle. And it has a later sowing date, which also gives us a little bit more time to make the most of the spring grass with our livestock. So very quickly we soil tested. We perhaps didn't give enough attention to remediating ex-maize ground, which was part of the 26 hectares of Finola that we grew this year. We cultivated, we did spray out using glyphosate, but we didn't use any sprays after that point. We fallowed that ground, put base fert on, we disked, power harrowed, rolled and drilled. We used 6-inch rows, and we used some starter fert. And our planting dates were 16th of November for half and the 5th of December for the other half. We had really good rain in the November planting and a follow-up rain, and we had a good rain straight after the December planting, but we didn't have another follow-up rain, which I think was a big contributor to things down the track. So just for a few pictures, that's our cultivation with the disking. This is our seedlings at day 9, then at day 16, so pretty rapid growth. Day 20, I just can't quite see past the thing now, 20 something, I think it's 27. And day 37. Now in this particular paddock, the difference between day 37 and day 50 on this ex-maize ground was just an influx of weeds in this paddock in particular. So amaranthus, annual grasses, and all sorts of stuff. And I thought that was pretty much it for that paddock, because the weeds just became so thick, but I'll pick up on that a little bit later on. This is one of our cleaner paddocks, and we got the best yield off this one and this is at day 50. This is day 58, looking between two different blocks, and they've actually been farmed. The farm on the left of that fence is a sheep and beef, our original block, and the farm on the right is a grazing block. And just with those yellower patches on the grazing block, I think there just wasn't as much nitrogen available, but also the biggest difference in that those two blocks was the block on the right had significantly lower organic matter. So I felt that was quite a big factor in the difference in what it looked like. But interestingly enough, the yields weren't too different. The paddock on the left actually yielded around nearly 1,500 kilos to the hectare wet, and that dried down to 1,400 and something. The paddock on the right was yield 1,400 wet, and that dried down to, I think, 1,260 or 70 something. So really good yields in those two paddocks. Unfortunately, in some of our other paddocks, we came nowhere near that. So it all averaged out to around a tonne to the hectare. But it was really exciting to see what we could achieve when we got it right. These are pretty much notes on just what I've gone through now in terms of me trying to observe what had been happening, and I sort of note that point around the organic matter. But please note, I did this part of the slideshow before the actual harvest took place. So perhaps I'll skip on this because I was making assumptions which, funnily enough, didn't prove to be correct as assumptions go. So I will skip on to our harvest time. So this is our best paddock that we harvested at that 1,500 wet, which dried down, but we were, had a really good run with everything. The weather, it was just perfect. It had, I had a really dry patch, and this was at day 78 or 9, this was harvested. So super fast, really. We were blown away. We'd been given the indication from Jason and Anita from Finola that it could be that quick, but it was amazing to see it come on. And this is our contractor that we got involved with, Gavin's feeding that seed in. I'm just mindful of time. I think you said around 10 minutes, Richard, so please come in and kick me off if I am. I've just got a couple more photos. These are a few challenges. When we got into the later planted stuff, it was a lot wetter at harvest time, and we were really battling with the birds. They came in, I think they got a bit of a heads up from the previous crop, and they soon told all their mates. We were a bit lucky with the first harvest, and then the harvest of the later stuff, the birds just piled in, and we probably went a little bit too early. It was still just a little bit green. We lost a lot of seed out the back, and we had some blockages in the throat of the harvester, and all that caked up seed created this sort of a gumming effect. And we got a little bit complacent in some paddocks. But interestingly enough, I showed you that paddock with all the weeds in it earlier on. That paddock actually was the second highest yielding paddock despite all those weeds. So it was just, I think it was a case of the plant had enough time to fill the seed and get that part of the growth cycle going before the paddock became sort of overrun. It was a hard job for the harvester, but we managed to get the hemp seed out. And this is us cleaning, having to clean between paddocks that gum off the walking floors within the harvester. and this is the drying equipment that we used at a contractor that we developed a relationship with to get that side of it done, which is super important, and to have the timing of that happen at the right time. And the final product being bagged up and ready to be sent to the final cleaning facility to be dressed and cleaned. So that is pretty much the end of the slideshow. I think I had really a sort of a 10-minute window to speak, Richard. So if you want to...
You've done very well, James. You know, that's it is hard to get a whole story into 10 minutes, so I thank you very much for that. And you brought up some really interesting comments about things that we'll probably get to speak to after the other panelists have given their presentations, but the bird pressure is a big one. Interesting about the weeds, how they got to the harvester. So hopefully we'll get some questions on that. But thank you very much, James. That was a great presentation. Really enjoyed seeing the photos too. Awesome photos. Well done, Ella. It's wonderful to see, and I'm really pleased that you're integrating it into your diet. What a great thing to do, you know, support your own best customer. But next up, we've got Andrew Ward from Assure Quality, which is going to be quite an exciting topic because there's so much happening in this space. And Andrew, if you could bring us up to speed, that'd be great. And we'll just go back onto our... I've just unmuted you, Andrew, or have I?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get this up, sorry. We'll just...
Right, we can see the slideshow there, Andrew. If you could just make it a little bit bigger, that'll be... Yep, we can see it, but if you can make it a bit bigger, the whole screen, is that possible?
I will try, yep. No, we might just have to stick with that, sorry.
Go for it, Andrew. We can work around that.
So yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity to present today for the group. Just to give a bit of background, that we've had quite a bit of interest from industry, farmers, MPI, and the Ministry of Health as to how we can identify where crops are being grown and how we can provide traceability, capture paddock histories, and also potentially sort out issues with cross-pollination. We've got people growing seed crops. So we've got two systems that we currently use that we wanted to share with everyone. One is what we refer to as SCID, which is the seed crop isolation distance mapping scheme, and also the seed certification scheme that's currently used for any seed that is grown for certification for either use in New Zealand or for export. So, but we see there's quite a few opportunities to assist the growers, in particular with providing certainty to regulatory authorities around the low risk with growing industrial hemp. So I'll just, because we're limited time, this is basically what we're going to cover. But I will also forward a copy of the presentation through to Richard so that can be shared with everyone, and happy to provide my details if anyone wants to follow up later. So New Zealand's recognised internationally for the high genetic purity of its seed exports, which brings many millions of dollars of foreign earnings back to the country. Part of the success of this is because the participants in the industry adhere to the principle of seed crop isolation distance mapping. So a major part of the seed produced in New Zealand is what they term multiplication and re-export, which contributes, I think it's around about $280 million annually to overseas companies. So New Zealand is known as good seed producers, and that we do have really good systems in place. So the loss in value to a grower and contracted seed companies through a single crop failure due to contamination runs into tens of thousands of dollars. And we've got instances like this year where we've had a potential issue that with one farmer, one paddock is worth $100,000 for a hybrid brassica. So it does show the value of what's being grown here. So the SCID system was developed through a MAF Sustainable Farming Fund project under the direction of and with the cooperation of the FAR, the Foundation for Arable Research. So it's a web-based system which utilises Agribase software. Now Agribase is a rural mapping program which is owned by Assure Quality and is used for various things. It's not for commercial use. It's actually to help NZHIA. So we assist with the rural emergency applications, such as the rescue helicopter. It was also used for tracking herds for bovis management more recently. So SCID, it's a web-based system designed to manage the isolation distances required between high-value cruciferous, which brassica and vegetable seed crops, so they do not cross-pollinate. So pollen from such crops can travel and pollinate similar crop species up to several kilometres away. We've currently set up hemp within the SCID system, and the isolation distance we've set between crops is 5 kilometres. So it's the pollen movement with cannabis is particularly high. So it's something that we've been quite cautious with in terms of determining this information, and a lot of our decisions are based around what's being used in Canada. So the scheme membership is currently voluntary, and that's the way we want it to stay. So there's no mandatory or legislative requirements for operators to enter crop sites. However, for the scheme to operate effectively, all operators who are producing vegetable, cruciferous seed crops, and what we'd like to see is hemp included in this, is that that require specific isolation or paddock histories. We strongly encourage them to use the system. So it currently is very well supported. So how it works, operators are required to register, so they get a log on and password, and the 2 registration options. Currently, a lot of the crops are actually entered in by merchants, so they can enter the crop sites onto the property, can edit any information on that crop site, change species, distances, they can increase or decrease isolation distances, and you can record information such as when it was sown, flowering dates, and if anyone plants a crop near to you, this is quite critical to the whole success of the program, it will automatically send you an email that says that someone else has planted a crop. So if you've booked that crop in the first instance, you have priority over it. Just in terms of the grower, the grower, they can also enter crops, but if someone does enter a crop on your behalf, say you're contracted through a merchant, you're still able to review any of that information. So you still have total ownership of that information. And also you'll receive automatic updates if anyone does book a property or crop on your site, which is quite critical. So using GIS mapping system, you can record crop sites, place boundaries around it. So it's very transparent and very user-friendly. So you can, merchants and growers can digitise a crop site onto the system and enter information about the species, expected harvest sessions, isolation distances, and sowing season. So you've captured all that information in one spot. With the use of the SCID scheme, it provides you with accurate geospatial mapping of where the crop is. Entered crop sites are issued a unique SCID reference number for added traceability, which is something that Ministry of Health and MPI in particular are very keen on seeing. Also, it's going to assist as we see the hemp, the growing of industrial hemp increase, better land use utilisation, and the restriction of the cross-pollination of crops. But also oversight of the location of all hemp cannabis crops in New Zealand, if it is made compulsory as part of the Ministry of Health licensing process. So it's creating an opportunity for the hemp industry and even the medicinal cannabis industry to actually go to MPI, Ministry of Health, and say, look, hey, we've already got a system that we could use. You don't have to be legislating and licensing. Here's a system that we're quite happy with. And I think that's critically important, just in terms of that self-management. We need to really take ownership and show how we can be responsible about managing particularly the industrial hemp crops. As we've had discussions with Richard previously, we see industrial hemp as just another crop. It doesn't have to have a lot of legislative control around it. So we can manage it quite nicely with the existing system. The other part of the system that I just wanted to touch on briefly is the New Zealand MPI seed certification scheme. Again, something that MPI and Ministry of Health are quite interested in. So with any crops that are to be grown for seed certification, there is quite a lot of information captured. And we see this potentially as a good system for growers, not only if they're growing a certified crop in terms of wanting to sell industrial hemp seed to other farmers, but because of the amount of information captured, so we can have all this information, we can actually register the crop, but then we could actually remove it from the certification scheme. But what it would do is that it would give us details of the seed to be sown, and we can even, in this instance with seed certification, we actually retain a copy of the label for authenticity. We would have all the grower and farm details. Importantly, not only for MPI and Ministry of Health, but also for growers, we capture all the historical paddock details on the farm plan, and we also track what's been grown for the last 5 years in terms of paddock history. So again, if there's any audit by a regulatory authority, we can actually show them in a very simple way all the crop history there. So, and again, each crop entry is issued a unique MPI reference number. So I think there's a lot of potential around using these. So and this unique number, it can actually be used for traceability right throughout the system. So we're currently investigating the use of that reference number being incorporated into one of the QR codes. So you could basically use that QR code right through the entire process, from, you know, as we often say, from paddock to plate. So there's a couple of really good opportunities there, and yeah, happy to discuss as part of the panel, or if there's any follow-up later on. Yeah, happy to take any calls or emails as well. Thanks, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much there, Andrew. I think that was a very interesting, really quick, of course.
Yeah.
Short trip into the seed certification, which of course is a voluntary system, as most things are to do with seeds in New Zealand in that sense. But it gives that information. So if you were a seed multiplier or a seed breeder wanting to export quality seed at that level, you would need to be certified. You would need that seed certification scheme, but not everybody would need it. as well. So there would be other growers that would say, well, I'm not interested at this stage. That said, though, the pollen issue is something that maintains an integrity of the seed certification system. So that would have to, everybody should be obliged to register for that. And that will be an interesting conversation to see if that can work in with the Ministry of Health's approach to processing the licenses and getting it done with Assure quality all at the same time. So it's a seamless process is the idea, isn't it?
Well, that's the whole idea, and it's not an expensive process, as we've seen with some other requirements, Richard. It varies between $10 and $30 an entry. So it's not an expensive thing to be part of.
Right. So, and keeping that compliance cost down is a big part. And
of course it is. Yeah. Yeah.
And I really appreciate you saying it's just another crop, because that's what we've been trying to get across to them for such a long time. Yeah. But also the traceability, I think, the other reason, if seed modification, yes, the seed certification system, but also that traceability is going to be important for food manufacturers and things like that, because it may not be important on the farm, but when the farmer goes to sell it and there's a tick box in the food company's product information sheet, then you need to comply with that. And people will be looking for the history of food, and as consumers start really taking a deep dive of where this food came from, given all the post-COVID fallout that we're going to experience in all sorts of disruptive ways around, especially that food and security of food production. So thank you very much for that, Andrew. And we'll just pass over to Anna now for our third presentation. Anna, over to you.
Hi everyone, those were two great speakers before me as well. It's really interesting to see how this industry evolves, how farmers start to take it on. We think there's some really big opportunity to complement sheep and beef and dairy operations in terms of income. So it is really exciting, but also the seed export market is very interested. It's, we're in crops like carrots, we've got companies doing very well because we can offer that counter-seasonal seed production. So I think there's really exciting opportunities for the hemp industry. On the first speaker, so James's presentation, he showed a wonderful picture of quite varied hemp, so hemp of a lot of varied heights. And I guess if I throw right up at the start, when we're talking genetics, usually when we look in a paddock like that and we look at any sort of trait, what we tend to see, or what we tend to find in any kind of trait, is that 30% of that variation that you can see in that paddock will be through genetics, and the rest will be through environmental factors. And in crops where there has been really intense breeding programs for a number of years, you'll see a lot more uniformity. And I think there's really good opportunity for us to develop hemp cultivars that are very well adjusted for our own season and our own latitude, our own soil conditions. And that's really what we're aiming for, is to start to develop a New Zealand hemp breeding industry. So, many of you really understand very well that hemp and cannabis has a very, very long history of use, and also a long history of breeding. And it's really only in the last 60 or so years that really got hammered or hampered. But in terms of modern breeding techniques, it means that a lot of those modern breeding techniques haven't really been applied. And I think that we've got a lot of opportunity to move quite quickly in using some of these modern breeding techniques with hemp to get things moving and get things adjusted for New Zealand conditions. When you hear about genetics, there's a load of words that you'll hear. And I just want to, on my next slide, really narrow down what I'm talking about here. And one of the fundamental things I really want to point out is that when we're talking about a hemp breeding program, we are not talking about genetic modification. So it is breeding for the genetics that are already in the hemp plant. And it's looking at variation across a really wide range of hemp cultivars and selecting for those traits that we want more of. So in terms of a New Zealand breeding program, we do have a lot of tools available to us, and some of those you'll hear about things like gene editing, genetic modification. We're not really interested in looking at them. They may have some place in the future, but we believe that we can make a lot of progress using what we call quantitative breeding techniques, which is around understanding our pedigree, making crosses between cultivars, then selecting for those traits that we're really interested in. We can use DNA technology as well to speed up some of our selection processes, but that's again looking for the DNA that's already in the plant, so we're not introducing DNA from another species. We can also use tissue culture tools, and some of you may have played around with ploidy, so actually doubling ploidy levels and things like that, which is your chromosome numbers, to increase yield. So there's all these things that we can do before we even touch genetic modification. And in terms of investment in genetics, if you think about something like fertilizer, you put fertilizer on a farm and you get that boost straight away in terms of productivity, but then that boost drops off, and so the next year you have to add more, or the next 2 years you have to add more. The great thing about genetic improvement is that if you make progress in 1 year, that genetic improvement is permanent. And then as you keep doing that over multiple years, it's permanent and cumulative. So once you start looking at breeding programs over a period of decades and start measuring that in terms of economics or trait progress, it's pretty significant and pretty exciting in terms of how quickly you can improve cultivars and improve species. The other really good thing about genetics and investing in genetics is that you can have bespoke cultivars for our environment or for our end users that we want. And there's also the opportunity to protect that genetics. And I'll talk about that in a moment. With hemp, I think we can jump on the back of some pretty impressive industries in New Zealand in terms of where we could go in terms of genetics and using genetics to differentiate our products. So Rocket Apple is a fabulous story. Zestberry kiwi fruit is also a fabulous story, and they're really built on the back of some very solid long-term breeding programs. And then just in that top right corner is Charlotte's Web, which you will all be familiar with, a cannabis species which has been bred to reduce epilepsy or epileptic fits, and has got a real name internationally in terms of genetics. And so I think there is the opportunity to do the same with hemp for food and fibre. Just to give you, when I talk about genetics, we'll talk about things like genetic gain a lot, and that's really that gain that happens year on year. You can see in that graph on the bottom left that this is within the sheep industry. You can see year on year that gain, and then what the value of that gain is on that y-axis in terms of cents. So when you look at over a decade, you can get a number of cents. So when you're talking genetic gain, you really are talking dollars and cents. And then I also will talk about traits a lot. So traits are really those individual parts of the plant that we're going to be selecting for. So we might be selecting for something like bud weight, or we might be, in the case of hemp, we might be selecting for fibre yield. And these are the kind of things we need to sort out within our breeding program as to what we're going to select for. In terms of what the real drivers of genetic progress are, there are four main ones. And I'm going to run through these pretty quickly, but there is quite a lot on this slide. Really, it's how intensely are we going to select, and you can imagine that's a numbers game. If we have really big breeding programs, then we get greater genetic variation, and so we have greater variation to choose from. And then also within a trait itself, some traits will have greater variation than other traits, and some traits will have greater heritability than other traits. So if you have a trait that's really highly heritable, so probably something like height in hemp, then you can make progress quite quickly. But if there's a very low or very narrow genetic variation in the trait in the population, then that's going to slow your progress down. So these are factors that we will take into consideration when we're designing a breeding program. Also, the accuracy of selection has quite a big impact. So the quality of the records, how easy a trait is to select for, and it just as an example, something like if you were looking at something like cannabinoid content, that's obviously more expensive to breed for because it's more expensive to measure those types of traits, as opposed to yield or yield of seed, for example, is probably quite an easy trait to select for because you can get those measurements pretty simply and cost effectively. We can use genomics, which is DNA technology, for some of those more tricky traits. But again, that costs a lot of money and time to get that sort of work going, and will probably require at some point, hopefully, some New Zealand government investment. The other really key factor in species that we look at in terms of driving genetic progress is the generation interval, which is how many plants, or basically how quickly you can turn the generations over. So one of the species that we work on is forestry. It's obviously a bit of a nightmare because you've got very long generation intervals, but hemp fortunately is much faster. If we're growing it indoors, we can do 4 or 5 cycles a year. Obviously with hemp itself, outdoor grown hemp, we're going to be looking at annual intervals. So really the first thing that we do is really understand the pedigree and the relatedness of our species, and it's really interesting. As I understand it, most of the hemp that's being used in New Zealand now is imported hemp, but I know that there's also people that have been breeding New Zealand hemp, and it'd be really great to get a really good understanding of what we've got in New Zealand, what's related to what, and then what is going to adapt best for our conditions. In terms of really setting up that breeding program, every breeding program will alter slightly depending on what it is that you're selecting for. So in hemp, we might be choosing to breed a line there we're selecting for fibre, but we also might have a different line where we select for seed. And it will, there will be situations where we can select for multiple end products. But what might happen is if you're selecting for fibre, you may, or if you're trying to do fibre and seed, you may get a drop off on one or the other than if you just went for one or the other, if that makes sense. And I'll go into that a little bit more in a moment. So we're really understanding when we set up a breeding program, what's our end product, what are we trying to achieve? And then we are within that, then choosing which traits we actually select for. So if we're breeding for fibre, then we might look at disease resistance, height, lodging, and then fibre yield. Those are the traits we might drive for. We then select our parents and make our crosses. And then we look at the progeny of those parents, and we look at both the physical characteristics as well as the genetic characteristics. And so if you can imagine, you collect a whole bunch of data on those crosses, and then you compare that data with your pedigree that you've built, and you start to build an engine of data and parental information that you can start to make assumptions on which lines you might select for in the future. You slowly start making selections, and then once you've made those selections, so once you've chosen your progeny you want to take further, you're really then trying to stabilise that genetics, and ultimately we would end up with hemp out there that's looking quite uniform in the paddock, and that'll make it easier for our harvesters and so forth. Uniform, but also really good results for the traits that we're selecting, for example, fibre. So just to, I guess, reinforce what I said before, look, we can't have everything in one strain, unfortunately. It's unlikely we're going to have a plant which is high in cannabinoids, high in seed, and great for fibre, all in the one plant. So we are likely to have have different strains for different end uses. And you can see as well, if you push too far in one direction on a trait, you will lose on another trait. So tomatoes, you can see that big ugly looking tomato on the left has obviously been bred for yield, but you can pretty much guarantee it doesn't taste as good as those other small tomatoes. So there is a trade-off when we're selecting for traits, that you will lose something by selecting for something else. And so it's understanding and really putting the mathematics behind that's what we do in terms of setting up breeding programs. On the right, bananas are a really interesting story as a cloned species. The Cavendish banana is a banana species that you all eat mostly in the supermarket, and most of the world's banana species are Cavendish bananas. The problem with that is that because we have narrowed our genetic diversity so much and we're mostly eating Cavendish bananas, there are banana diseases out there that threaten to wipe out the entire banana crop. And so I guess really emphasising here that retaining some sort of genetic diversity in our lines is also really important, and that we don't all end up with one cultivar and then lose those interesting genes that we might need for disease resistance, but we also might need for consumer traits later on. So just very briefly as well, and I'm happy to talk to anyone about this more, our company, we have a fully owned subsidiary called Genetics, and we have a data management system for breeding programs. And I'm happy to chat with anyone about this, but it allows us to, or allows the breeder to record large amounts of data, work with us to design those crossing plans and have all that data recorded and saved in a very logical manner. The thing about if you're entering on any kind of breeding program is that you will quickly gather large amounts of data, and having that in an organised setting is really, really important in terms of getting that maximum information out of that data. And then if you take that further, we have another product called GemStock, which allows us to use that same data for regulatory purposes as well. So you can know at any one time where your seeds are, where your plants are. So happy to chat with anyone more about this if you want to make contact with me. And finally, I feel like this has been a bit of a whirlwind, but finally, I guess I really want to emphasise here that New Zealand has gone down the track of being a commodity producer in some of the products we've produced, and we really can't afford to be a commodity producer in either hemp or medical cannabis. And you can see from that graph up there how quickly price per pound in this case can change in a short amount of time. Hemp is likely to be a commoditized product over the next decade, and we're not at a cropping level. We're very unlikely to be able to compete with Canada or China in terms of mass hemp production. So therefore, in terms of where we're thinking for our hemp industry, we really need to be locally responsive and be able to provide the right products for our local needs. But we also really need to make sure our programs are geared towards those end products so that we can take products through to end products and play in what we call a value add space internationally. And on the bottom right, you can see there's a couple of slides within the sheep industry. So there's a group called New Zealand Merino, and they're selling merino at great prices in comparison to crossbred wool, which gets sold in bales, and the whole industry has just been absolutely hammered. So I think we want to be in that, in that value add merino space rather than the crossbred wool space in terms of anything we do with hemp, whether that be fibre, seed, or oils and cannabinoids. So thanks very much, and I'm really happy if anyone wants to reach out to me at any other time. So thanks, Richard. I'll pass back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. That was a nice way to finish as well, because that commoditisation discussion is a big part of what we want to avoid, really. And we do have some really good role models. You mentioned the kiwi fruit, the wine industry is a good example of collaboration and getting those exports done. And I mean the fact that you can add value, so therefore you're creating employment, and then but we've got to tell our story better. These branded products, there are niche markets in the global sense, and some of these niche markets are obviously quite huge. So even how we scale to meet the demand, should we be able to when we get to these niche markets, we're going to possibly have to work together as well. So lots of opportunities for collaboration. And that is a question I just wanted to put out there as far as the breeding side, because there is, we've looked at going to the SFFF and things, and we will be doing so, but they're interested in very new and innovative rather than business as usual. So a plant, merchant might want to know something about their varieties and be interested in a variety trial, but that could be considered business as usual and the benefit for the merchant. Whereas if you're now looking at how to get hemp into a farming system, what does it mean for planting and follow-on crops, that's one body of work. And then there's this other body around breeding. Is there some way that we could work on that collaboratively to get that foundation knowledge out there? So then Abacus Bio could then be commissioned to really take the deep dive. But is there something we can do to begin with that process?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it is I think you're dead right. I think when you go to those types of MB organisation and SFFF, you have to show that transformation. But there is a trade-off because there's some basics that we need to do as well. So it just means in putting those kind of bids together, you need to have that combination. So you have the basics in there as part of it, but you also have that really transformational piece. And I think when you write and put those bits together, you can really combine them so you have the best of both worlds. I think in terms of I've got some quite interesting ideas in terms of thinking how the New Zealand industry sets up hemp breeding, hemp and medical cannabis, because I think the kiwi fruit and some of those other industries are very much government driven, whereas there is a lot of private enterprise already in the hemp industry, and I don't think we want to lose it. I think that's a really, really important part of our industry, and it's also going to be a really important part of our genetic differentiation. So what we want to be able to do is set up a system whereby we allow that private breeder to flourish, but we also support the private breeder with some tools that the government might help support those tools, if that makes sense. So that we're having, I guess, almost a platform whereby private breeders can jump on and use those tools, but the government is still investing into that platform.
And you would get those private breeders involved because of the tools that you can provide them, but also it's another form of registering their varieties in this genetic sequence sort of type of situation as well. So very interesting. I just asked other panelists to come on with their videos. There was so much going on in there that I've got a whole lot of questions, but I feel that we should address some of the attendees' questions first. So thanks very much for coming back, James and Andrew. I hope you enjoyed hearing each other's presentations. I mean, we did cover quite a lot of ground there. Yeah. And we're going to see how many questions that we can get into. And thank you, James, for getting on and answering some of those questions in the background and in the chat and things. Very technically savvy of you. Very good. So first of all, well, there's one question here from sales. It's probably for you, Andrew, in the sense of now the 5 kilometre number that's been nominated. That's sort of a standard sort of number from the OECD type. Seed certification systems have this distance, and we're happy with that. The question comes in that the observation is that pollen can travel, quoted here, 30 kilometres, and it can grow quite a way. So, is 5 kilometres enough, or is that enough to satisfy the scheme?
Well, what we've done is we've looked at quite a bit of data on it, and it varies. OECD, it varies between 1,500 metres up to 10 kilometres. So we weren't too happy with that as a range. So we looked at Canada actually, because we've got quite good linkages through to the hemp industry in Canada, and we adopted what they're using at the moment, which is they have it based on miles, and it worked out about 4.8 kilometres. So we thought, well, 5 kilometres gives us good coverage anyway. So, but to be fair, it is a moving target. We're trying to do some work with Brassica at the moment and using Seed Industry Research Council to do literature research, because a lot of that pollen movement is based on overseas information, and we really want to try and capture some information under New Zealand conditions. So, but we're pretty comfortable with 5 kgs. It's sort of right out there, to be fair. So.
Right on, and struck on another point. We need this information for New Zealand specific conditions, don't we? This environment that we have that's uniquely ours, which could lead to all sorts of potential marketing opportunities as well. So and as long as these things are compliant with the OECD and ayahuasca, ayahuasca, so they're already established things, and I think in New Zealand sense, especially if the medicinal cannabis and things start growing outside a lot more, then this pollen issue will be quite a conversation, in which case it might be that there's going to be some geographical features like hills and things that could slow it down. But also you might end up with a regional bias towards cannabinoid type products versus, broad acre industrial hemp for seed and fibre.
And that's what they do in the Canterbury region, in particular with brassica crops. Anything like radish species, which pollinate very, very easily, they've, as an industry, come together and said, well, why don't you grow it in this one area, sort of thing. So it's being managed really well, and that's the thing with the skid system. It's a voluntary scheme, but growers and industry together have taken ownership of it because they want the best outcome for everyone. So not only themselves, but also for their customer. So that's really good focus, and I think that's the way we should be approaching it.
Well, back to the collaboration required for the industry, at this early stage, we need to be working together. And so people aren't buying the property in the wrong place or thinking that they can do some things that, is going to be affected by a farm that's already existing down the road.
Exactly.
A question for Anna. At the moment, what's the most important plant characteristic of hemp that needs to be improved to adapt the production to adapt to the production environment in New Zealand?
It'll be interesting to ask James that one actually, because I think it does depend on what you're growing for. So, but James, from your point of view, what was the most disappointing trait, if you like, in terms of from a farming perspective?
From the cultivar that we brought in?
Yeah.
We were actually really happy with the cultivar we brought in.
Yeah.
We did a lot of research, and I've seen a lot of hemp crops around New Zealand the last sort of 18 months, you know, prior to planting our one. I guess, yeah, like I know you mentioned there's quite a lot of variability in height and that sort of thing, but really compared to what I've seen before, and I can only judge it what I've seen here in New Zealand, we thought it was actually pretty good. Like we had a nice run with the harvester over a pretty good, you know, small variation of height in the plants. To be honest, most of the challenges we had were external from genetic variation. But yeah, listen, from a grower with only 1 year experience, I'd need to have more knowledge on it. What I can say is from the people who have been growing for Finola, which is one of the base kind of seed production cultivars, they've been growing it for 25, 30 years now. There has been a lot of progress on that, and it has been obviously one of the base cultivars that other cultivars have sort of gone from, you know, being one of the first low growing cultivars out there. Yeah, I think I'm probably drifting away from your question there. Probably I'm not that qualified to answer.
Maybe, well, what's really interesting as the industry evolves, what we do is really understand the economics importance of each of these traits. So how important height might be versus disease resistance versus something like cannabinoid content or fibre content, depending on what we're breeding for. And then we put that economics over the top of those traits, and we select for multiple traits, but the weighting on the more economically important traits is higher. So you make more progress in those that are going to make you more money, essentially.
Yeah, well, at the moment in the state of the industry, you know, we chose to go with food because that's what we could process in the North Island. You know, there's the option of doing fibre now in the South Island, which is amazing, and we would love to have that opportunity in the future. But that's why we've gone for a low growing, high seed yielding cultivar, and that's worked out pretty well for us in this instance. But I totally understand your comments around, you know, I don't think we're going to get a cultivar of hemp that's going to do all of the uses, A, because there's so many different uses, and B, it just gets too complicated at harvest time, I feel, from someone who's pretty new to the industry. But I think if you're going to be doing seed, you go for seed. If you're going to be doing fibre, you go for those decent sized plants, and perhaps keep things simple from a processing and machinery perspective at harvest time, until technology can get to the point where we can be doing all sorts of things in one pass in the field.
I think you guys are talking in the direction of, you know, the end use of the product. So, you know, a fibre crop, because, you know, you plant a fibre crop differently. You know, we haven't got onto the deep dive into, you know, planting rates, which is it's an art, not a science, because everybody has a theory on planting rates. It's wonderful to have conversations with people that say, oh, no, you can, you know, you need 30, 40, 50 kgs hectare, and others that say, oh, no, you know, 1 kg, 2 kg. So depending on what you're growing for, if it's a broad acre crop, if it's a market garden regime, all these things come in. But I think, you know, the lead from, and as you said, Anna, which is an economic lead, is from what the consumer wants. So if the consumer, you know, wants a bigger seed because the dehulled seed looks better, and that means that the food manufacturer is demanding that, then it all flows backwards. So we need to be working on that whole value chain and answering these questions, because as you pointed out, even though we're an annual crop, a bit quicker than pine trees over 25, 30 years, it still takes some time to get that breed happening. So, and all those traits are, you know, wonderful. And I think, you know, some of the genetics that we have already in the bush in New Zealand, you know, they've had an amnesty and allowing that. that to go to the medicinal market. So, and you know, finola and things like that. But people need to respect the plant breeder as well. You know, it's taken a lot of time for finola to be got to where it is, and there's other approved varieties on the list as well that have all taken a considerable amount of time and effort and investment for the breeder. So, you know, you shouldn't be just sort of ripping them off, as it were. You know, it's like playing a record and things. You know, it's better to do it by Spotify or some such thing. But the next question, and I appreciate that we're getting close to the time. There's a question: is there anyone in New Zealand engaged in certified seed production of cultivars actually grown in Europe? So this is example of that multiplication. So that does happen in New Zealand, yes it does, and those people involved in that, Midlands are a good example, looking at taking, you know, smaller amount of seeds. Now if you're importing seeds, you've got to keep, you know, there's a lot of things to do. You need an import-export control permit, drug permit. You know, that takes time to get. You've got a massive amount of biosecurity implications, so your phytosanitary documents are, you know, have to be top-notch. But people have done this learning curve, so it can be done, and Midlands is a good example, as I say, of taking a small amount and then sending back tons. And the idea being that we're in the off-season to the Northern Hemisphere, so suddenly that Northern Hemisphere breeder can get 2 bites of the cherry per year rather than just waiting for their season to come around again. So jumping on to the next one. Are you recommending growers not focus on dual tri-cropping there? It's an interesting question. Again, everybody's going to have their theory. You do tend to play to your strengths because it's easier to harvest, as James was saying, a smaller stature crop. As you know, if it's a seed crop, everything's set up for that harvest. But there could be economic opportunities and things as the fibre side develops. And what James was referring to was the decortication process going into Christchurch, which could be replicated around the country because this is a bulky raw material. You don't want to ship it very far. You've got to add that value locally. You know, that's the regional development implications. That's why the jobs are going to be created in rural communities. So there will be, if the economics stack up, a decortication process put into the Waikato where James might be able to supply some of his stems. And then James would have to come up and say, well, do I want to grow a fibre crop? What are my yields worth? What are my returns worth? Can I get my follow-on crop in there quick enough if I'm retting the stems on the ground? All those sort of things come into it. But again, massive amounts of study required to see how industrial hemp fits into our farming systems. And this is foundation knowledge, so everybody benefits from that, and it's new knowledge and it's technically, you know, up there as well. So it's transformational, Anna. So let's get those SFFF people who are waiting to hear from us. You know, they're very supportive, as are many government departments, and we'll be looking at that tomorrow in our export sort of and strategy and that sort of thing. So we're looking at more of a in consumer use in tomorrow's webinar. But those are some amazing questions, and I think the bird pressure, we could go on. I mean, we need to be considering pests and diseases and all sorts of other things in there. The common thing is from a farmer's point of view, is birds, of course. But these will all be expanded upon in our hemp and Summit and Expo next year in May 2021. So put that in your diaries, everybody, and I encourage you to come along and network and meet the people here on the call. And have your questions asked and answered. But is there anything anybody else would like to say before we wrap up? No? Okay, very good. And I'm just trying to scan. I think we've covered most of the questions, and James was kind enough to answer some of them while we were going on. And I think, you know, you've all said you would make yourselves available, so I'll put that link, Andrew, to your presentation. If anybody has any questions, just send an email to admin@nzhia.com and we can put you into touch. But I think there's all sorts of opportunities in the breeding one. It all leads together, doesn't it? You know, because of course Assure Quality is going to be testing soils, and as will our other testing members as well, with Hills Laboratories, Course Ron, and Analytica. So there's an exciting time, and this is all breeding that ecosystem around the hemp industry. And the great thing about that is it already exists, and people like Anna and Andrew are just going, well, this new one is quite exciting, you know, this cannabis, this hemp. So there's a really goodwill for it, and it's an exciting time to be involved. So I'd just like to finish off by saying thank you to all our panellists, Andrew Ward from Assure Quality, Anna Campbell from Abacus Bio, and James Bailey farmer from Chibao. So thank you very much, everybody. And as I say, we can keep the conversations going next year at the summit. Look forward to seeing you all there.
Right. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.